resulted in a flood of 120,000 Tutsi refugees into Uganda and other neighboring countries. But extremists of the Hutu power movement, supported by Rwandan military forces, and the notorious Interahamwe youth militia were opposed to the infiltration of the so-called Tutsi cockroaches in Rwanda. For them, the Tutsi problem could only be eliminated by eliminating the Tutsi. The arrival of President Habyarimana's sleek Falcon 50 aircraft was broadcast live on the popular RTLM, Radio-Télévision Libre des Mille Collines, the mouthpiece of the Hutu power extremists. Suddenly, a loud explosion was heard throughout Kigali. The announcer stopped. An interlude of classical music followed. Then the news bulletin came. President Habyarimana's plane has been shot down. The president is dead. On final approach, the aircraft had been struck by 2 surface-to-air missiles in rapid succession. It had crashed in a great ball of fire, its wreckage strewn across the Kanombe neighborhood, not far from where Eloge lived. RTLM was quick to blame the Tutsis. For the extremists, the time had finally come to exterminate those they labeled as cockroaches. In the 100 days that followed, up to 1 million people were killed, a rate of mass murder far more efficient than the Nazi concentration camps. An estimated 3/4 of Rwanda's Tutsi population was slaughtered before RPF forces defeated the genocide. It was an archetypal genocide, even by the appalling standards of the 20th century. On that fateful evening, Eloge and his family left their home. They were running to save their lives. We had learned that groups of soldiers were walking into Tutsi homes and killing everybody in them. My father's brother was already killed. We hid in the bushes all day that first day without any food or water. We could hear gunshots being fired and people yelling as they were being killed in their homes. My sister was still a baby, but she didn't cry. With a touching grace, Eloge tells me how in the days that followed, his father was killed. As I listened to him over dinner at an Indian restaurant in Montreal, I remembered visiting the Hindu temple in Kigali some 20 years earlier when I was on the ground with the UN. It was close to the Amgar garage owned by George Rutaganda, the notorious vice president of the Interahamwe. The militia had conducted house-to-house searches and set up roadblocks to weed out the Tutsi among the terrified crowds in the streets. Their task was made easy because Rwandan ID cards indicated the bearer as either Hutu or Tutsi. The political construction of the Tutsi as a foreign race had its roots in European colonialism. The Scottish philosopher David Hume captured the prevalent sentiment of the time, declaring, in his words, Negroes and in general all other species of men to be naturally inferior to the whites. There never was a civilized nation, he claimed, of any other complexion than white. This theory couldn't be reconciled with the sophisticated Tutsi kingdoms in Rwanda and Burundi. The inconvenient fact of African civilization, whether in Aksum, Benin, Ghana, Mali, Zimbabwe, or other ancient empires, required a conceptual solution consistent with the white supremacist ideology. The Hamitic hypothesis, as it became known, posited without any evidence whatsoever that African civilization could be attributed to a diluted subspecies of the Caucasian race that had migrated to the continent. In regard to the Tutsis, therefore, it could be concluded that although they were an inferior race compared to the Europeans, they were a superior race compared to the Hutu, and thus racially predestined to rule over them. The traditional Tutsi-Hutu social class structure was thus transformed into a rigid racial hierarchy. Consistent with the eugenic pseudoscience of the time, anthropometric measurements among Rwandans, such as the differing height, nose, and skull size of Tutsis and Hutus, became the basis for conflating outward physical characteristics with hereditary differences in intellectual and moral capacity. The ID cards thus recorded this myth of racial hierarchy. The accompanying feelings of historical humiliation would in time be exploited by extremists for political ends. Identifying the bearer as either Tutsi or Hutu facilitated the extermination campaign. At that roadblock close to Angar Garage, many were killed on the spot with machetes and clubs, depending on what was written in their ID cards. Others were detained in the Hindu temple before being slaughtered in a nearby valley. Many women and girls were subject to horrific sexual violence before their death. Nobody was spared, not even the children. Behind the Angar Garage, amidst bright flowers and eucalyptus trees, we found an open pit. It had been filled with mutilated corpses, like the many others strewn across the streets of Kigali. 1 million victims was an inscrutable statistical abstraction, but the intertwined bodies piled on top of each other told a more intimate story. Their faces stared back from the grave, silently screaming, "Why?" Each had a name, I thought, a universe of thoughts, emotions, and relations, unrealized dreams and ambitions. Now they lay there, motionless, their lives extinguished by the ravages of blind hatred. As I remembered that grim scene, I was horrified to think that were it not for random chance, Eloge too would have met that same tragic fate. On April 7, 1994, after spending the night hiding in the bushes, Eloge and his family arrived at the entrance of the ETO school. It was considered a safe haven because a contingent of 90 Belgian peacekeepers had been stationed there. Codenamed Beverly Hills by the UN soldiers, it was anything but a glamorous location. Thousands of terrified Tutsis had overwhelmed its classrooms and grounds seeking protection, as they had done at churches and schools and hospitals throughout the country. They came bleeding and limping, with deep gashes and open wounds, in stunned silence like the walking dead. Outside the school gates, the Interahamwe roamed menacingly, brandishing machetes and clubs, guns and grenades, drinking beer and chanting hateful slogans. They made clear their murderous intentions as the crowd of some 2,000 cowered in fear. All that stood between them and a grim end was the UN presence. By the time Eloge and his family arrived in the evening, there was no more room in the UN compound. The schoolhouse and surrounding playing fields were packed to the hilt. Despite their desperate pleas, his family was turned away. That night, he told me, we tried to go to a school that was protected by the UN for shelter. We were not allowed in because they had too many people there already. We slept in a dairy farm that night, and then we walked through a long, rainy day trying to leave the city of Kigali. Being refused admission at the school was the best thing to happen to Eloge. Had his family been allowed to stay, they would all have been killed. In the following days, the Force Commander General Dallaire sent an urgent request to the UN in New York. He wanted to strengthen the peacekeeping force with an expanded mandate to protect civilians. But contrary to his pleas, instead of increasing the UN force, it would soon be withdrawn. Stopping the mass murder of Rwandans was simply not a political priority. French and Belgian soldiers would soon arrive on military aircraft to evacuate the UN forces and Western expatriates. On April 10, the arrival of French troops at the ETO school had been celebrated with cheers by the terrified crowd. But the soldiers had come to help the UN withdraw, not to save the Rwandans. The following day, on April 11, the UN vehicles began to leave the compound one by one. The men and women, children and elderly chased the soldiers, begging them, please don't abandon us. Others tried in vain to hang on to the trucks as they drove away. Soon the convoy was gone, and with it, their last hope for survival. Devastated and defenseless, those left behind could see Rutaganda standing menacingly at the school gates. The frenzied Interahamwe militia were just behind him with machetes and clubs. The people knew what awaited them. They began to cry. Eloge was unaware at the time that being turned away from the ETO school had saved his life. He was on the run with his family, trying to survive against the odds. He recounted the horrors of those days. That week was a nightmare for me. I saw people being killed. I saw hundreds of dead bodies floating in the river. We were literally running for our lives. We also had nothing to eat, which made us weak and terrified. It was a Holocaust in the making, but not one concealed behind the walls of concentration camps. It was unfolding in plain sight, and the world watched on television and did nothing. By April 21, 1994, the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 912, abandoning the Rwandan Tutsis to their fate. Exactly 1 year earlier, on April 21, 1993, at the opening of the US Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, President Clinton had bemoaned the death of millions whom our nations did not or would not or could not save. But Holocaust remembrance was a fetishistic incantation for distant events, its historical lessons divorced from present realities. For pragmatic decision makers and so-called realists, it was now time to pull out from Rwanda. No politician would lose votes for forsaking an obscure country in Africa, even at the cost of 1 million lives. Thus it was that exactly a year after the solemn pledges of never again at the Holocaust Memorial Museum, the Security Council turned its back to the victims of genocide while absolving bystanders with the euphemistic jargon of diplomacy. The catastrophic failure of political will, the callous indifference to this grave injustice was sanitized as an adjustment of UNAMIR's mandate. It was a green light for the génocidaire. The dead speak no more, and the survivors try to heal their wounds as best as they can. We express sympathy for their suffering. We indulge in the familiar refrain of never again, and sometime later, we find ourselves recycling the same empty indignation for some other calamity, at Darfur and Aleppo, the South Sudan, the Rohingya in Myanmar, or some other exotic place that momentarily captures our attention until it is forgotten in the oblivion of past tragedies. In lamenting these calamities, we labor under the misconception that atrocities are like an earthquake, a tsunami that comes out of nowhere to destroy everything in its path, a natural rather than man-made disaster. The prevention of genocide isn't about waking up at the 11th hour when atrocities are imminent. There is no UN 911 emergency number to call. By the time the Interahamwe were outside the gates of ETO school, the options had already been narrowed to the use of military force. And whether we like it or not, intervention was too politically costly to be feasible. But even if there was a will to intervene, mobilizing troops is a time-consuming process in a situation that requires rapid intervention. We must therefore search for solutions that aren't dependent on a messianic savior arriving just in time to rescue the victims from the clutches of death. In preventing mass atrocities, the measure of success is what doesn't happen, what never becomes headline news. The time to intervene is before the disease of hatred becomes virulent, before manageable conflicts escalate to the point of no return. And sometimes, if we act in a timely fashion, the solution may be much simpler than we imagine. Getting rid of lice is not a question of ideology. It is a matter of cleanliness. The words are seemingly innocuous until we appreciate the context. Nobody likes lice. They're a cause of infestation and disease. We wouldn't think twice about eradicating the filthy insects. But Heinrich Himmler's use of that metaphor on April 24, 1943, in Kharkov, occupied Soviet Ukraine, was far from innocent. The notorious Reichsfuhrer of the Nazi SS was motivating his foot soldiers with a passionate speech so that they would dutifully obey orders to exterminate Jews on the Eastern Front. The Einsatzgruppen death squads, not unlike the Interahamwe, were instrumental to implementing the final solution. But the soldiers needed to overcome the reluctance to murder the innocent. Anti-Semitism, Himmler explained, is exactly the same as delousing. The Holocaust, it has been said, did not begin in the gas chambers. It began with words. Cockroaches and lice, snakes and rats, the dehumanization of others is always a precondition for their